everyone, and welcome to the Talent Gap Fireside Chat, where we talk about causes of and solutions to the talent gap. I'm your host, Pete Strauss, and joining me today is Sam Oberholzer. Sam is a sales team lead at Coro. So welcome, Sam.
Hi, Pete. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to talk about some of the challenges and obstacles I think that we're seeing from not only hiring, but then a little bit of a retention. So I think this is going to be an exciting afternoon for us.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us. Could you give our audience a little background on yourself and your career so far?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been in my career for about 8 years. I actually have always been in some kind of aspect within compliance or audit or cybersecurity. They all definitely come hand in hand. My role has definitely changed throughout my career. So I started off working at Deloitte, implementing security, privacy best practices, helping with the IT assurance aspect of it. And then I slowly worked my way up within the CPA world, became manager. That's where I manage not hundreds, but probably like 50 consultants, but also manage hundreds of projects. I believe you know what we're talking about because that's essentially how we kind of know each other. But then from there, I landed in sales. Being technical, having that understanding that education really does help the sales process. And so I'm still within cybersecurity, just in the more pre-sales role than actually serving a customer.
Very cool. How have you found the transition from kind of delivery to the sales side? Has that been a pleasant change of pace for you?
You know, I'm a busybody. I think a little bit of the skills transferred. I went from consulting to being solution seller. So I think that's a huge term that a lot of sales folks are using to this day. And I definitely think that having the knowledge base to speak the language of the prospect is useful. There's some other tasks that, had to be learned a little bit, like being a little bit more urgent, for instance, I think, or, following up in a way more timely manner on the prospect side than what the customer would be used to. But I definitely think the skills have transferred nicely. And what I'm doing in sales is almost what I feel I did in consulting with relationship building, really building that trust. I just don't have to actually perform the technical work. So I think it comes with its benefits as well as challenges, but I absolutely love it.
Very cool. Yeah, I could see where your technical background would definitely serve you very well. Do you have any thoughts on salespeople in general? Like, do you think salespeople are generally not as technical as they should be, or are they an appropriate amount of technical in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the company, but overall, I think salespeople flow between different industries, between different even services or technology that they're selling. Because in sales org, I definitely think they pay more close attention to the tangible, soft, and administrative skills for sales folks rather than the technical skills that might have to be involved with it. And I think that's definitely across the board. So there's definitely benefits that I see in being a little bit more headhunter, resilient, because that happens way more often than when you have to deal with, a customer or have more of a technical background. So overall, I think sales folks are not technical just based on how they usually follow more of the skill set and they don't really care about what industry they serve.
hmm Yeah, I've definitely seen a tendency for salespeople to switch from industry to industry. And I think generally there's a sense from sales management that if you can sell one thing, you can sell anything. So there's, as long as you have the core sales skills, people skills, stuff like that, you tend to do okay. I would kind of personally make the argument that it helps to be a subject matter expert in whatever industry that you're in, kind of like in recruiting. Ultimately, we're in kind of a sales function in recruiting. We're selling people to people in two different
Hmm.
directions. So it
That's right.
helps to be able to screen those folks, at least on a slightly deeper level than maybe some generalist
Yeah.
security recruit or
And
generalist recruiters can.
yeah, and that actually does bring up a little bit of another benefit to being somebody that used to be on the other side of the house, actually serving them once the sale was made and proving that they bought the right thing, and they partnered with the right company. So I'm very vocal on LinkedIn. I've spent years on building an audience just based on the customer base that I had at the time. And so I think it comes a little bit more naturally for me to fill my right audience because I'm also speaking what they care about, and what I'm used to. And so I think that kind of helps when you have that technical educational background. You're able to consistently fill your community, your personal network with the same people that you've been serving throughout your entire career. And that kind of goes hand in hand with like staying in the same industry. And so I see that as a benefit. And I think that's something that maybe I have a harder time with losing if I change industries.
Hmm. Yeah, I feel like once you develop the specialty, it pays in a lot of cases, not just monetarily, but
Yeah.
from from a time perspective. If you don't need to relearn the whole thing all over again when you
Hmm.
switch, helps to kind of develop a specialty. And I'm seeing that in the more technical disciplines within security as well. Is that once people kind of start to develop a specialty, they kind of go deeper and deeper into it in a lot of cases. And those are the folks that make a lot of money and
Yeah.
are really highly sought after. It's because they've developed a deep skill set in something that not everybody has. Then you have your generalists that can basically do everything. As they say about the CISSP, it's a mile wide and an inch deep. Those folks are, I think, always going to be employable, but maybe not command, top of the market salary like somebody who's highly specialized would. So, you definitely have had an interesting background having been on the technical side, as we discussed, and on the sales side. Have you noticed any differences in terms of the way that hiring or recruiting is approached from a sales perspective versus, audit firm, for instance?
Yeah. I think from the sales side, it definitely reinforces the similar skill set that what they're looking at. I think a little bit with that is that a lot of the expectations are a little bit more vague or blanketed. And I feel like a lot of when hiring managers put out job descriptions or put out what they're looking for, I think a little bit of it misses the technical skills. And then you'll see that gap once you hire them. And it wasn't really discussed because usually in sales, I feel like it's a nice to have the same industry, but it's definitely not a barrier at all. I mean, you can definitely speak a little bit more to that. That's just from my experience over the last several years. Um, but then on the other side, there's a little bit of an expectation to learn that, but yet it's not really held accountable. So there's a little bit of a gap from when someone hires versus what they expect versus what they do to train that. And so that's what I feel on the sales side of the house. When it comes to the audit side, I definitely think they expect requirements like at least CISA, at bare minimum, or if you're going for a management role or a director role within audit, then they want to see something a little bit more mature in certification. So I think they definitely put a technical expectation on the role that they want of somebody. But then when they're hired, they're really like for the majority of the part. I don't want to say anything like wrong with like CPA firms, but then at the end of it, then there's no really accountability past that because a certification is a one and done almost. And a lot of the times there isn't keeping up with that certification or keeping up with trainings. So I think a little bit at the end of the day, it comes back to not really accountability with holding someone up to the standard of education and technical skills that they might seem like that they have on their resume. And so
Yeah,
that's just where I see the difference a
yeah,
little
for
bit.
sure. In my experience working with consulting firms, seems like every consulting firm only wants to hire from their direct competitors from other consulting firms. Whereas sales, they might be a little bit more open minded in terms of, if that person has sold a service and they're a security product company, that might be okay as long as they kind of know the industry and they're a good salesperson.
Yeah.
I've always been a big advocate for on the audit side for consulting firms to consider people from quote unquote industry because I believe that's a vast, underutilized market
Yeah.
of candidates that all these consulting firms are just not hiring, but they could be. Often the feedback I'll get if I'm advocating for a firm to hire somebody from the internal side, I'll say they've been a customer, so they understand what an external auditor or assessor, the way that they should approach that customer, the understanding they need to have, how to get evidence out of people quickly and meet deadlines and stuff like that. So I think that's all very valuable. But the typical pushback I'll hear is, well, they can't handle the pace. They haven't been in consulting.
Absolutely.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's actually a good point because I feel like that's probably a little bit the biggest difference that I think that with the audit, that fast paced is very fast paced, but it's not as much as expected than like sales for when people are in sales because it's fast paced no matter what. Like sales, everyone's used to it though, and everyone's resilient for that. And I think that's some of the skills a little bit that differs between the two. And also differs between like the gaps in hire is that usually audit is, depending on the company, is very fast paced or just long hours. But with sales, it's everyone's expected to almost get everything done between that 9 to 5. You might go a little bit over like either way or before, but that's the time you have. You don't really work that much after unless it's like admin task. Because keep in mind, we're still cold outreaching a lot of the times with direct sales. And so you have to use that time to finish basically all of your skills for that or all of your tasks for that day. So I think that's where a little bit is different, but that's where usually salespeople, have that soft skill or know what like their personal skills that they need for sales versus a little bit audit where that's a little bit, I guess, a little bit more lax because you have time to do it at night or you work a little bit longer and do that. So yeah, I definitely see that. And one question I had for you, since we're on the topic of both, I feel like right now, based on the market, based on the recession, based on a lot of companies are letting people go. And please correct me if I'm wrong. So I would love to hear you, but I feel like in sales, since I feel like the technical skills are necessarily required, that everyone wants to get in sales. So it's hard to hire because the pool's huge. But then in the audit world or the consulting world, I feel like there's a gap because people need to hire and they can't fill that. But I would love to hear if that's accurate and not just based on my own like biased opinion.
Yeah, no, I definitely see that. Like I said before, I think when it comes to sales hiring managers tend to be more open-minded. They'll consider people from different backgrounds, be it customer service or like retail sales, stuff like that, into these higher level white collar sales jobs. They'll consider building training programs more often. They're more willing to hire at the entry level, which is a big problem, I think, in cybersecurity overall, is just lack of entry level hiring. Whereas with the audit firms specifically, they seem to be very, very narrow-minded in terms of the people that they'll hire, what that ideal candidate looks like, and they just keep that pool super narrow. So when you have such a narrow definition of what a good hire looks like, there's not that many people that match that description. and GRC, IT audit. It's not what I would call maybe the sexiest profession. So there's just a lack of people looking to get into it, I think, in general. And part of that is lack of awareness. There are quite a few colleges at this point, though, that are designing, MIS programs and have fraternities specifically devoted to the intersection of accounting and audit and technology, which is great to see. But ultimately, I think we just need more people in the audit profession, in consulting. There's just too much work to be done, and a lot of the firms, Big Four included, have started campus recruiting programs, and that's been successful. But in my experience, it's just never been enough. There's not enough people flowing through that pipeline to fill demand for all of these compliance, regulations and standards and mandates. Basically, every SaaS company out there needs a SOC 2, and there's just not enough SOC 2 auditors. And I think the reason that, I guess that phenomenon has led to a lot of the automation platforms popping up, which seems to be,
Absolutely.
The latest phenomenon in audit and compliance right now. That's been really interesting to see play out. I think we always needed some sort of automation in the field because, again, there's just not enough people to do the work. Have you kind of seen that move in the market, in the compliance space?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, I came from a compliance automation SaaS that actually bridged the gap for me between leaving audit and consulting. And then going into more of a technology, into sales. Like, that was the easiest transition for me because I already had that background and I was already the face, talking with the direct line of the same people that I would be selling to. That actually, I think this all kind of makes sense to me, because what you're saying is that the audit firms, the CPA firms, they have a little bit more strict rules or requirements on paper, but it's kind of funny because I feel like anyone can learn it. And most audit firms don't even really expect you to be technical. They just want on paper that certification or experience. But then from my experience in consulting, a lot of the times they're not technical. They really don't know what they're doing a lot of the times. They know how to go about the process, but then the technology is a little bit of gap of knowledge. But then, and that's why they can't really get people, because they have strict on paper what they need, even though they don't enforce anything in person or when you're actually there. And then on the sales front, I feel like it's a little bit more vague. Maybe they accept a little bit more entry level, but then again, there's still that gap when you're there in the person, because there might be trainings, they're available. There might be technology to your own trainings, but then it's not really as expected. And so that could almost reflect your own, quota attainment or metrics. So I think they have similar gaps, but in different times. But even though it's kind of opposite on paper for when you actually are trying to hire.
Yeah, you mentioned something interesting about KPIs, about metrics being tracked. And I think whatever metrics you track drives behavior. I saw this when I worked for a huge corporate staffing firm. We had to make, I think it was 40, 50 outbound dials a day. We had to talk to 6 people a day, and we had to submit at least a few resumes a day. So with those kind of numbers, when we had a daily stand-up talking about our numbers, that's all we focused on, because that's what we had to do, because our whole job, everybody was breathing down our neck about our numbers. And if that's the case, you're not focusing on other things that are really important, like how many people are you actually getting hired?
Yes.
Same thing on the sales side. If you're in a sales role and all they care about is your dials and your touches and stuff like that, but they're not looking at how much do you actually know about the stuff that you're selling, that might be an important thing to track. And on the sales side, I hear often from, on the audit side, I hear often from security engineers, the technical people, that look, this auditor is auditing our environment, but they have no idea what they're looking at. They're just trying to check a box.
Yep.
So how do we incentivize, I guess, people to take that technology training? How do we get hiring managers and decision makers to send their people to training when maybe they don't see it as a true value add because they're focused so much on the day-to-day numbers and hitting those metrics? Do you have any thoughts on what they?
Yeah, I absolutely have a lot of thoughts on that because I think about this all the time. I mean, humans are one, habitual, and two, need boundaries and rules, or else things just like can't get done. And especially in work, where they're also trying to balance their own personal life. Work, they're just trying to almost get by a lot. Of course, people like work. I'm not saying that, but at the same time, you have targets for daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually. And so, one thing I think has to, it always comes down to process and culture. It has to come from top down. Leadership has to believe in the fact that education is important for everybody, including themselves. Because what I see a lot of the times is that the managers, the directors, the C level doesn't even know really what the product does or the services, or they rely on someone else to, manage that, or they don't know the technology that they're using internally to perform their job because they think high level. So I think it stems from top down, and then it has to be enforced, and someone actually has to monitor this to keep it enforced. That's outside of the manager because they care about other reports. They care about training and maybe the skills for that job, and not about the education or the cybersecurity that they might be selling. So I definitely think it's a collaboration, but it has to come from the top down and has to be enforced and placed in their own KPIs. Like, we have to mandate this and not just give them the tools. We have to show them how to use the tools and when to use the tools.
Could you see something like that being implemented as like a policy in an employee handbook or something like that? I'm just trying to think of how you would set up a system to where people were actually incentivized to do that from, a tactical standpoint. So
Yeah.
work with HR then to assure that there's, budget for each salesperson or each auditor, whatever it may be. So, they can do it on an annual basis and set that expectation, roll it into their annual goals.
Yeah.
You're looking at performance evals.
Yeah. I think one thing, you're absolutely right with HR, whoever might be that learning and development or person or team. Because again, sometimes, and it depends on the size of the company too, because I really do understand that depending on budget, and what you can do for resources, it might have to be on the manager. But what I do see it is not necessarily handbook, because I feel like people just acknowledge that and it's a one and done and you're done with it and no one reads it. And unsolicited advice here or from that. But I think there has to be someone or team in a perfect world that would monitor that. And so the way you incentivize someone is you do tie it to their metrics, just like in sales where you have to dial 100 calls a day and that's a metric, yet it doesn't matter if it's quality or not, so that has to be just pushed within the same KPIs and tie it to your own performance or whatever rubric people are using. I just have not seen so much of it. I've seen where companies really do put in a lot of money and time into developing their people, but then it's not really tied to the people's performance. It's just indirectly talked about. So you absolutely have to tie it directly to someone, or it's going to go one ear out the other. It's going to be seen as a checklist to be completed. And then it's not going to be almost done on a daily basis or required to be implemented into your own day-to-day responsibilities. So I again, it just kind of stems from a more leadership role or like leadership and making sure that then their directors, or that if you hire someone or have a team, that they can have their KPIs also tied to that, which is tied to the education of their people.
Very cool. Yeah. Yeah. Top down, I think, is the right approach. a lot of people I talk to as a recruiter, they'll say, I'm really interested in doing more training. I don't know what I need to do to, get another certification or what it's going to take to get promoted. That's another thing that should, I think, come from the top down to help retain people. So you've been a manager previously in the audit space. You've been in sales now as a team lead. I'm sure you've encountered some challenges, we'll say, in hiring people, in interviewing people, and stuff like that. Do you have any stories you could share, or any comments there?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's kind of similar to how I even go about to even like training or leading people. So I think of myself definitely as a servant leader. Like, I'm the person that I need to do the work. Like, if they need me there with them, I'm not just going to tell them what to do. I'm going to tell them how to do it and help show that any way I can. And this comes even from when I was managing in the audit world, even team lead now, even hiring. I feel like a lot of the times, and I'm going to speak a lot around like top down, like leadership, because I have my own, metrics that I would hold someone accountable, even myself. But if someone above me doesn't look at that and hold me account or hold that to my metrics, then it gets lost. So a lot of the times I've noticed, and this is just a story, kind of like not specific story, but what I feel like kind of across the board is that if I try making something more descriptive or metrics or involving things, then it completely gets lost and I'm just tied to something else. But then, like cold calls, for instance, or something else that they have on the rubric. And so I noticed that then I'll spend my, 20% of my time on the management or the education, but then they think that I'm doing, if I don't hit the mark somewhere else, that they hold me to the metrics, then it's completely missed. They don't even see it. So that's where I'm kind of like seeing a little bit of where I disagree, because I think, again, since it should come from top down, that has to be on the same page, or else it's going to be missed with like metrics across the board.
That makes me think then that if you could implement something like a 360 feedback program where the higher
Yes.
ups in the organization could get some suggestions from people below them, that then the decisions would come from the top once they made that decision, but they would feel the feedback from the underlings to understand, here's where we're really missing an opportunity to train people in that case, or track metrics that maybe are better representative of actual success in the role versus just, we've always done it this way, so this is what we continue to do.
Yeah.
I think a lot of, especially old sales tactics are ripe for innovation. Sales, recruiting, same thing. There's recruiters doing email blasts still. I thought that died 10 years ago, but it hasn't, apparently, because I hear people complaining about it on LinkedIn all the time.
Oh my gosh, I didn't even think about that. But it's true.
That's how CISOs end up getting contacted for security analyst jobs, because they were a security analyst 20 years ago. And that's their LinkedIn profile. So are there any practices like that you can think of that you would change if you could?
Oh my goodness. Specifically on sales. Yeah. I mean,
or audit, or, anything that you've encountered.
I just think volume in general and automation, I think everyone can sniff through the BS. And so I think that's just, you need to connect with somebody, or at least show them what you know, but wherever they are. That's a lot of like the misconception, I think, at least on sales, is that, you might be trying to talk at somebody in LinkedIn, but they're really in a community in Discord, which is a lot of technical folks in general. And so I think a lot of automation can be a waste of time. And it's almost like the definition of insanity for a little bit. And then again, also cold calls, a lot of the times, like a lot of companies just push too much for that. And we live in a digital world. So like the yellow pages and white pages are not the commonality of trying to actually get a hold of somebody. which also comes to, again, to the audience or the community that they're involved in. So you need to educate yourself. Again, it's just always back to a little bit of education and a little bit more effort than what you might be used to. In terms of the audit world, I think it's kind of similar, but it's more process oriented of automation. Well, I guess that's kind of the same as sales with the technology, but with audit, everything's manual. But a lot of the times, people try automating their own process by using the same templates, by not customizing things to someone's environment, and just like basically reusing, refreshing. And I think if we put a little bit more thought, it would be a little bit more value filled. And so that's just where I see a little bit difference. But then we bring up the compliance automation tools. That's different because the automation comes with evidence collection or integrations, and not 100% of, the same shell. So that's just where I see it, that I would probably change it a little bit. But I think, again, then it comes down to scalability and your resources available too. So can't solve it all.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm a huge advocate for personalization in general in recruiting and sales and business development. I think people respond well to when they understand that you understand them and that you've done your research and that they're not just another number on a spreadsheet somewhere. I'm connected with a lot of CISOs on LinkedIn, and I often see huge, long rants about this is what the sales guy did and it's terrible and you guys got to stop spamming me. And same thing about recruiters. There's a lot of frustration with the email blasts and the cold outreach that is not targeted at all. So I'm a big fan of what I call mass customization. Candidates can do it on their side by having a few different versions of their resume for a few different job functions that they're targeting. Recruiters can do it having a good template that looks very customized, but isn't necessarily. That's something I leverage. I think salespeople can do something similar. And then just letting go of some of the old practices that people just can't stand, and actually listening to the community, the people that you're trying to sell to or that you're trying to recruit. Spend more time on LinkedIn, maybe just scroll through your feed, and eventually you'll see somebody talking about what your profession is doing wrong. And I see it all the time, obviously.
And then take that feedback. You know what I mean? Like, don't just read it. It's just like, take it, because that's important. Because even customization for your audience is important, because it's different from a CISO, which gets 1 million calls, versus maybe someone with a more specific job title or a different type of maybe acumen that might be used to wanting to answer calls or answer this because maybe they're not as busy. Like, it's kind of wild right now, which is hard because trying to figure out what actually resonates, especially in the more tech side, is difficult. It is, because they're so busy anyways. It's like, catch me if you can, and how you can, and where you can. And I have to be there at the perfect moment.
Yeah. And there's so much overlap among all of the different salespeople. Their strategies are all very similar often, and they use a lot of the same terminology. CISOs will complain about the use of FUD, FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt when selling a security tool. And that's so common. So, but I think the only way you can really get around that sort of cliche, those sort of cliche tactics, is really going back to what we were talking about earlier, understand the tech better, be able to go deeper than the surface level. If you're approaching somebody as a prospect, you really need to understand their pain points from an operational, a deeper level than what salespeople typically understand. And that's going to be a differentiator for you, whether you're salesperson, recruiter, auditor. If you're an auditor and you're talking to that security engineer and you actually understand their AWS instance, and the 10 auditors that were in here previously don't, you're going to be their person. They're going to respect you more. They're going to be more likely to provide evidence quicker and stuff like that. So that kind of wraps it up, I guess, in a neat little bit.
Well, it's kind of funny. Like, as you were speaking, I was just like thinking, I'm like, because it kind of goes back to, if we're just in general, especially in sales, and probably not because you're also trying to sell them, your services still. It goes back to, what is their job title? What's their metrics tied to? And what do they care about on top of that? So like metrics and what they personally care about, because that's how you get in. Like if you can tie what you're selling to what helps their metrics, once you figure that out and what they value, then you immediately are tied to them and they care about it. And that's just like so funny that I kind of think of, even with, like if we're doing like the gap in just talent in general, that's kind of similar. Like how you were talking about, if a hiring manager would have a rubric, but then tailor it depending on who it is, or the candidate looking for jobs. Because I experienced this before and giving advice where they didn't tailor their resume, even though it could be the same resume, just flip a couple words because skills are transferable. But you have to meet certain criteria and metrics for you to even get past that resume point. And so it all is very similar, that you need to customize based on a certain metrics of either the job or that person. And then that's how you get stuck, or like you stick with them. Like that's how they see that you could be of value to the job or being a vendor.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to stand out these days in general. Everybody's just so inundated with so much media and social networks and salespeople and recruiters, and it's never been easier for people to reach other people. And so there's an exhaustion that goes along with that. And when you're exhausted and you're not receptive to people reaching out because you got hit by 20 recruiters this week already, it's really hard for the person on the other side of that to break through. And really the only way I see to do it is just know more than your competition. Come at it from a deeper level than your competition. Buddy of mine, Joe Hudson, he's been a recruiter for less time than me, but he's more technical than me just because he reads so much. So he's just a world-class recruiter, one, because he cares, and two, because he spends so much time reading and understanding the tech that he's recruiting people for. And that's just, you really can't say enough about it, in my opinion. So I think we hit that point home pretty hard there. What about on the hiring side, in recruiting and interviews and stuff like that? Have you encountered any specific challenges in the hiring positions that you've been in?
Yeah, I think it kind of tailors back to people not customizing. It's really wild because I feel like if I'm just talking about like the candidates I've interviewed or just the resumes I've reviewed or just their knowledge, because I don't have any doubt and experience, but for them, if I'm talking to them, it's more like I feel like a lot of the times people get flustered in the volume of who they're interviewing for. Like, I need to get my resume out to 100 people. So almost the automation that they don't take a second to even know who I am or who the company is. And so a simple question of, what you value about the company or how would this benefit you kind of a situation. It's not even a specific answer. It's like blanketed. I'm like, okay. I just think to myself, like, you couldn't go that extra step. And I guess when you are, recruiting and prepping people, do you see that this is kind of an issue? Just like either getting people to, actually educate themselves on the company or the people they're interviewing with or the services if it's not what they're used to. I guess I'm a little bit trying to understand that process because that's what I see. Probably like one of two people, so 50% of the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's probably a bell curve, like basically anything else. You have the vast majority of people that put in a middling level of effort. Then you have a few standouts that really didn't do anything, and a few standouts that they really knocked it out of the park. So yeah, I would say most people are somewhere in the middle. They do enough to get by in an interview, but then there's some people that will, research the role and the people ahead of time. I send LinkedIn profiles of hiring managers to everybody so they can do that.
Yeah.
And over the years, I've been able to kind of identify those standout candidates just from speaking to them for a few minutes. It's just kind of a skill you develop over time, I think. But yeah, they're definitely rare. I would say that the ones that go above and beyond, for whatever reason, it seems more common these days for a lack of professionalism, both from the candidate side as well as the client side. I've noticed a marked uptick in lack of professional behavior. I don't know what it is. I don't know if social media has something to do with it, if people are just being overworked, if people are disorganized. I think that's a lot of it, personally, is disorganization.
Same. I think so too. Because I think a lot of it too is the fact that a lot of interviews are remote now and you can go anywhere. And so if someone doesn't plan, sometimes they'll show up a minute before. And like planning includes your outfit, your attitude, your sleep, what's distracting you, And so I think that kind of comes into it. But one thing I was thinking about is feedback. I think a lot of hiring managers in companies or even HR states they don't like that they can't provide specific feedback. And then I think sometimes, the reason why people might not be prepared is because they don't know. And again, like humans need to be told, or sometimes they just don't do it because it's habitual. And so then you keep going down this track of almost, again, with the same definition of insanity of doing the same thing that isn't working. And I think that's just kind of like a little bit, I just started thinking, I'm like, I think a lot of it might come with feedback, like not specific feedback. It could be a blanket term, like you're not right for us or you don't have the right experience, but it really might be you didn't show up professional. You showed up late. Your resume you didn't print out, or it's it could be XYZ. So yeah, maybe incorporating that into like more specific with process.
Yeah, I could speak to some stories there. I've always been a believer in feedback after interviews. I think it really does help people out. The challenge is, as the hiring entity or as the recruiter, whoever it may be, you're opening yourself up to potential legal action if you give people tangible feedback and it's not what they want to hear, even if it's, legitimate and you're trying to parse that feedback in professional ways and things like that. I've had it backfire on me personally, where I gave a guy some feedback. He had cussed in interviews, and that wasn't received well by the hiring manager. And so I told him that via email. Well, he threw me under the bus to the hiring team, emailed the hiring manager, and like I said, threw me under the bus and basically complained to them, big long email. So after that sort of experience, I think if anybody's been burned that way before, they're less likely to give feedback. I still try to at least give something to people so they understand what they did wrong. If it was a lack of a certain skill, or if they didn't present well, you have to be really careful about that one. Anything intangible is super, super risky to give.
And I feel like subjective. Like with but that's the thing. Like, I don't feel like that's your job necessarily, because you're still at the mercy of what they want to share. Almost, I feel like, or it might backfire again, because that wasn't maybe necessarily talked about. Which again falls back to the company, like being transparent. And I totally get the legal actions, but I also kind of feel like it's not like it was against maybe any discrimination. But I can also see, because if they didn't say up front, hey, don't swear, even though that's business etiquette, like don't swear, like as small as that, but it probably comes back to being upfront. But then again, like sometimes why would you have to, like with certain etiquette? I don't know.
I had a guy once that talked politics in the interview because he was certain that the hiring manager agreed with him, which obviously was a mistake. So, yeah, I mean, some of the stuff you would think goes without saying, but unfortunately, it's not common sense to everybody. And you have to be careful, even if something is not a protected class in
Hmm.
terms of EEOC or EOOC, I forget exactly what the acronym is. It can still potentially get you in trouble, even if you've done nothing wrong, somebody can still sue you, and then you have to deal
Yeah.
with that headache. Uh,
Well, actually, I want to know if because this just came up. I know this might be a little bit on a tangent, but also it still deals with the hiring manager, like the lack of transparency after confirmation and validation. So one of my friends and they basically got signed an offer letter, but before that has email train of confirming start date. So the company wanted them to start on June 5th. But then she said she has a trip that she can't cancel. So can I please start June 19th? Talked to many people. They all confirmed. It's in email. It's on the offer letter for June 19th, signed. But then they called saying, like, we have to revoke it, your offer letter, because we need June 5th or nothing. No examples, no reason why. What's your take on that? Is that typical that you
it's not a good
experienced?
look.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that it's typical, but I've seen offers rescinded for all sorts of legal and illegal reasons. Um, the sad truth is, really, offer letters have no teeth.
That's
So,
what I thought.
yeah, I mean, at will employment is a hell of a thing. So, even if somebody had an employment contract in place, chances are they wouldn't have any recourse. Depends on the state too, but
Mhm.
yeah, that's a scummy thing to do. And I think if you are going to rescind an offer like that, you should have some sort of reason, if nothing else, to cover yourself. They may not have a leg to stand on legally if they were to sue you, but again, that's a hassle for you. So least
Mhm.
thing you can do uh, is just let them know something,
Yeah.
or, I mean, I hate to say it, but make something up. Give
Yeah.
them some
No,
sort of reason.
exactly. Like, give the decency because, and I feel like there's so many contracts, even now, where you can revoke the employment no matter what. Like how they blanket term a lot of things in contract. Like I don't have to give a reason. But it's almost to me thinking like that kind of brings down like your reputation. Like you risk kind of that motion because people talk. There's reviews. Like we all know that you can rate an interview process. Um, so yeah, I just thought that was interesting because I personally haven't really seen a like revocation from a 2-week start date or of that. And if there is legal issues or if you can bring up legality, but it seems like no.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there, unfortunately, I've advised people in that situation too, where they kind of got in a terrible situation that wasn't their fault. Wrong place, wrong time.
Yep.
Best thing you can do is just move on. It's
Yeah.
a numbers game. Stewing on it is not going to help anybody. Unfortunately, I've been in that situation myself professionally, where decision was made for me, and I didn't want to be in that situation, but I had to just make the best of it and move on. So that kind of brings up an interesting point too. If you're caught in a situation like that as a candidate or as a hiring manager, say somebody canceled on you last second and they were supposed to start Monday and they rescinded their own offer on Friday. I've had that happen too.
Yeah.
You just have to move on. Think about what you can do to get that person in the door quickest, that next person. If you're on the candidate side, think about what you can do to secure new employment. Think about what you learned in that interview process. That if there was a red flag or there was some indication that something like this might happen, pay extra careful attention next time to make sure you don't get into that same situation. Yeah, I could tell you some stories for sure.
We
Some
probably
I'm
can stay
probably
here
not
for a
allowed to.
while. Yeah, no, it was just funny because it just happened, like right before we were about to do this podcast. So I just thought it was interesting. I'm like perfect timing almost during the
Yeah,
hiring process or
on
gap
the
in a hiring process or feedback or
yeah.
something.
I mean, on the employer side, people don't realize how important it is to keep your employer brand intact. It's not something a lot of hiring managers think about. They'll think, okay, we just need to get somebody on board. If we get somebody on board, great. Let's not worry about all the other people that went through the interview process or that applied and never heard anything. Especially if you're a smaller company and you're trying to scale and you need to hire a lot of people very quickly. Quick as and in a lot of cases, like was the experience when I worked for a startup, we only wanted to hire as a consulting firm people working at direct competitors. We needed to hire very quickly. There's only so many people that meet that description. If you have a limited candidate pool, you can't afford to burn any bridges in or around that candidate pool. So if somebody, for instance, doesn't have the consulting experience, but you want to hire somebody with that consulting experience, but you don't get back to them, they might know somebody with consulting experience that they advise, hey, don't go interview with that company. They completely burned me, ghosted me, whatever it may be. When it's a limited candidate pool like that and it's a small industry and you don't have much of a brand to go on yet and you're trying to build a company, super, super crucial to get back to everybody. For every hiring manager listening, it takes just a little bit of time to touch base with your recruiting team, your HR team, make sure they have some sort of control in place. Like, what's your process for getting back to candidates? It could be a one-click reject in your applicant tracking system. And it's so simple. And I don't understand why every company doesn't do this, but so many don't, because I hear about people complaining constantly on LinkedIn about how they're just getting ghosted by every single company they apply to. How it's so rampant is just beyond me. It's such a simple fix. Have you ever been through anything like that, I guess, yourself on the candidate side?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I was leaving audit and trying to explain that my skills transfer out of, CPA or consulting, I was interviewing a lot. And I think it just goes the same as just follow up and even sales now, or just, networking events or anything, just like connecting or following up with somebody, because you never know where your paths will cross another time. But also the industry keeps getting smaller. Like, networks get smaller. People talk. That's why, people go to different communities to talk, especially if one just gets saturated with other audiences that you don't want. But then to your point, and in this situation, if they weren't going to hire that person, they're hiring someone else. So they have to go back to probably someone that they denied or didn't talk to. So it's like, how do you win them back if you already burned that bridge? Like, it's just fascinating to me how much time can be wasted based on just not being like human with that. Because that's just etiquette. I feel like you would majority of people wouldn't let their friends down like that constantly or let their family down. So it's almost like thinking like that, like bringing some of those emotions and soft skills to business.
Yeah. I just had an idea. Think of it like your mom just applied to that job. How would you treat her? If you wouldn't treat your mom that way, don't treat anybody that way. And that's probably a good rule of thumb.
Unless you want to hear the wrath constantly for the rest of your life, and it won't be let down. We all know that. It will be remembered forever.
Yeah, and people will hear about it for sure.
Yeah. So on that note,
So on that note, we're coming towards the end here. So one last question for you, Sam. Is there anything we're not talking about in the industry, but we should be, especially as it relates to hiring?
I think it just comes to this. I think it just kind of summarizes everything we talked about. I know we went through a couple different topics, whether it's hiring, but I think the biggest thing is the retention, the education, the making sure, that your employees, that once you hire them, that they trust you and that you're doing what was told during the hiring. Because I think that's probably a big gap that we didn't really discuss, that like holding the people accountable and the people like the managers, directors, leadership accountable to whatever they put out there, making sure that it actually is the pathway in their career or actually is the responsibilities that they do. Because I do see that happening a lot. And why people leave is because they're doing something on top of something that they were told they were going to do. Or there's that, the OTE or the base salary gap that if they're doing 2 jobs, then they should do a little bit more, So it's just thinking about the retention, thinking about what goes into that, whether it's metrics, whether it's career path, whether it's culture, whether it's education. I think a lot of that just needs to be held, because I think that's where a lot of the times people get lost. And just like thinking about that, like actually understanding to yourself, like, why are we losing people? Did we not provide them feedback? Is there not follow up? So just putting that into account, because I feel like if we're thinking of hiring or retention in terms of sales, it's the same exact thing.
So to kind of summarize that, setting expectations in the beginning of employment with somebody new, sticking to those expectations, fulfilling promises, listening to people with an ultimate effort to hold on to people, because that's going to help you solve your corner of the talent gap. Well,
Yep.
That's a great place to wrap up. Appreciate you being on, Sam. If people want to find you online, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn. I have my name as Sam Oberholzer, but my backslash of LinkedIn is Samantha Oberholzer. Very vocal, I love helping. So if anybody does want to get into or have questions around sales or even consulting, or cybersecurity or compliance, huge network can definitely help. And I think that's a better start than trying to do it on your own.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being on, Sam. Thanks, everybody.